Hey there! I'm Chroma, and today we will be creating this fancy rainbow effect to give our game more pizzazz. We will be making this effect where an object will change colors between kind of a rainbow pattern to make it more fancy, more appealing, for in this case a kind of collectible sort of object. As well, we will make it so that we have a lot of customizability in how we can change how the effect is applied to our objects. We can make them super slow, a sort of slow gradient. We can make them really fast. We can invert how the rainbow effect is applied. And we can also change whether the effect is applied randomly to all the objects, or if we wanted to, having all of our, in this case, these collectibles here, have them all go between this rainbow effect in sync. So that is what we will be creating here today. So without further ado, let's get started. Alright, so starting things off, you may notice that this scene looks a bit familiar, and that is because it is more or less the exact same scene from my last tutorial on making simple player collectibles. Now, I'm not going to be going into all of the platforming and collectibles and how all that stuff's done, because I just made a tutorial on that. If you want to see that, you can go check that out. But here, we are just going to be making things fancy. Basically, just making the rainbow effect that you just saw on these collectibles here. I thought they would be a good, place to show this effect in action. So the only thing that we're really concerning ourselves with all the stuff in our scene are these actual collectible objects that we're going to be giving this rainbow effect, and over here in the scripts folder, this rainbow effect script that's going to do all the magic to get this to work, which is currently empty, and we're going to be writing the code to make it work right now. The rest of that, you can go watch those other tutorials if you want to figure out how all this is working. But yeah, so let's go and begin getting this rainbow effect to work. Now, before we jump in the code, I want to kind of explain how we're going to get this to work. So, on our collectibles here, there's a bunch of different, or any object basically, you have a bunch of different components that are on objects by default. Now, what's of interest to us is this thing here called a mesh renderer. Any object that you have in Unity will have this mesh filter, that's the actual mesh, so like the cube or the cylinder or the player model that you have, and then the mesh renderer has to do with the materials on that object. Now, in this case, you don't really need to concern yourself with all the options on here. The only thing that's of relevant note is the fact that we have this materials area here, and we have our collectible material, which is just yellow right now, on this object. Now, you probably have some experience, making materials and putting them on objects, but what's really happening when you drag an object onto or when you drag a material onto an object, is that it's assigning that material over here in this mesh render. Now, yeah, I don't need to go into all the complexities of how anything else in this works. All that's relevant is that we're basically going to be modifying that material mid-game to get the color of our objects to change. In this case, to like a rainbow color. So if we go to our, not rainbow color, it's more every like frame, the color of it's going to be changing to make that rainbow effect. Now, on this collectible material here, you, again, have a lot of options how you can slightly change the materials. The main one that's of importance to us is this albedo area, which is basically just the color, the tint, or like the actual color of this object for a basic material. Now, under here, yeah, you should know this already, I guess. I'm just going over it because it's what we're going to be using, what we're going to be coding, and I want to explain it enough now so that when we're coding stuff with it, it makes sense where I'm getting these numbers and where I'm getting certain information from. So hopefully it all makes sense. So here when we're modifying colors, actually by default, I think, you'd be working with RGB, which is red, green, blue. And this is how colors work in Unity. You have a combination of a red, a green, and a blue value, and those sort of get multiplied together to create the colors, in this case that you see, like this purple color or this green or whatever. Now, you have different options kind of here of how you're modifying this color here. One that's of interest to us is HSV, which stands for hue, saturation, and brightness. I don't know why it's a V. It stands for something else, but it's basically brightness. So you may notice here that the hue actually kind of already has in it what we want. Like going between the hue value, we go between this kind of rainbow effect that we want. The saturation is just how much of the color there is. Zero saturation is white. In this case, we were going to want a full saturation to have a bright color, basically. And then our brightness here, that's just going between, like, how bright it is, black and how much of the color there is. So in this case, we're going to want both the saturation and the brightness here to be 100, and it's actually the hue that we're just going to want to get that hue value and then just keep modifying it. You'll notice that at both ends is red. So what we're going to want to do is get it to go from its lowest value all the way to the highest, and when it gets to that highest, we're just going to want to loop it back around. So in this case, when it's 360, we want to make it 0, so then it'll kind of, you know, keep looping around, basically. Okay, so that's all the Unity stuff I just wanted to explain as, yeah, a prerequisite knowledge before we go into our code. Now, there's also different ways that you could go about applying a rainbow effect. Through animations could be another way, but I wanted to do a code way so that it's more modifiable. And yeah, so that is what we're doing. So now we're finally going to go into our code and we are going to actually make this effect happen. So with this rainbow effect script, it's going to be applied to every single one of our, in this case, our collectibles, whatever objects we want to give the rainbow effect. So like I said before, we're going to want to be changing the actual color of the material on the object. So the first thing we're going to do is get that material that is on the object. So in order to do that, the first thing we're going to do is go private. Now you may have noticed, or I said it, the name of that component was called a mesh renderer. So we're going to get the mesh renderer component from the whatever object this is on, and we are just going to call it mesh renderer, the exact same thing, but just with a lowercase m. That's just what we're going to call it. The name doesn't matter. You could call it like MR or something. Then, or that's just setting up a variable. Now we need to go and actually get the mesh renderers. How we can do that is in start here, just going mesh renderer, the one with the lowercase m, the name of our variable, equals get component, and then in angled brackets, mesh renderer. I don't know how in-depth to explain some of this stuff because I don't know, you know, the skill level of anyone watching this tutorial. My hope is that, you know, you're able to follow along. I'd rather explain it thoroughly and make sure that you follow along, and if you fully understand this stuff, you can just skip ahead, as opposed to not explaining stuff enough and then people getting lost in all that. But anyways, so we have the mesh renderer object now. Get component is just going to grab that mesh renderer thing and store it here. So now we can go and work with it. So as an example, just to show something here, if we were to go mesh renderer dot material, that's going to get that material that was on the, in this case, the collectible. So it's going to grab that yellow material. We can then go dot color, and then we can directly set the color here if we wanted to. So there's actually some shorthands for doing stuff like this. If we go color dot, let's say red, this is a shorthand for like some predefined stuff that Unity has. If you just go color dot and then some basic colors, you can just assign stuff to be some specific colors if you wanted to. So for example, this would take that material and make it red. So I guess I'll just show that off because I can, I suppose. So this isn't doing anything close to a rainbow effect yet. But now, I didn't save it, did I? Oh, not there, over here. Yes, saving our scripts because that's kind of a necessary step. And then making sure the scripts are actually on our collectibles, which they already are. I did that before the tutorial started. They were just empty scripts. So now when we go into play mode, ta-da, they all turn red because that's what we told our code to do. So we know that that's working. So that's good, I suppose. So that's not fully what we want. We want it to go between all the different colors. And more specifically, the hue value that we saw, we want it to be modifying that value. So we're going to get rid of that for now. And actually, I'm just going to paste it down here because we're going to kind of be using some of this just so I don't have to retype it all. So more explanation stuff real quick is that in order to modify the color the way that we want it to, when we go and get this color value, it's going to actually be using that red, green, blue values that we saw before, not the hue, saturation, and brightness values. So we need to make it so that it's using hue, saturation, and brightness. And then set those and then put it back into being red, green, blue, to then put it back into the color. Hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully it'll make more sense once we actually type out the code. So now the way that we're going to be doing this, we have to actually store what that hue, saturation, and brightness are in order to actually then be able to modify them. So we're going to make some more variables at the top. that are going to be floats, which just means a decimal value. That's going to be hue. Then another one called sat for saturation, because I don't need to type out the full things, and then I can actually just copy this. And then another one called just brie for brightness, because I don't need to type out the full things. It should be self-explanatory if you're seeing this to know what those are. So having those values, now we're going to actually go and store stuff in them. And Unity has a handy function that can do that for us by going color dot RGB to S or HSV and just hitting enter there. And actually, I'm going to let this show what the autofill kind of thing is. So we have this function color dot RGB to HSV that takes in an RGB color, and then so it has outfloat H, outfloat S, and outfloat V. So we're going to actually put in the three variables here, and then this function is going to store stuff in those three variables. So that's why we needed to make them. So first we have to pass in our RGB color. Well, that's the color of the material, whatever it currently is. So in this case, like the yellow. So that's actually going to be this right here. So that's why I left it down there. We're just going to paste that in there. Then outfloat H. So we have to actually type the keyword out, and then our hue variable, then out sat, and then out brie, or brightness, whatever. So this will take our RGB color, that is the yellow, and then it's going to store the hue, saturation, and brightness of that color in these three variables. So then, just to show what we're going to be doing with this, actually, no, I don't want to directly copy that. There's then another function that you may have saw for a brief second that is the exact opposite. That is color dot HSV to RGB. And this takes a float H, a float S, and a float V. So if I put that in here, we could then go and pass in the hue, the sat, and the brightness. And this is actually going to kind of output the RGB equivalent. So this is kind of the inverse function of this. They're opposites. So then we can then go and put in our material color exactly like this, where instead of setting it directly to red, setting it to whatever that RGB color version of that hue, saturation, brightness color is. Right? Hopefully that makes sense. So now this isn't doing anything. All we're actually doing here is getting the hue, saturation, and brightness from our original color and then putting it right back in. So this isn't really doing anything right now, but we're now able to mess with the hue, saturation, and brightness. So for example, if we wanted to now take the brightness and set it to 0. No, I'll take the saturation and set that to 0. As we saw, setting the saturation to 0 will make a color pure white. So if we then go take that saturation and go equals 0 and just leave it like that, and then we go back into Unity over here, wait just a second for that to compile, and then go into play mode, we can now see that all our objects turned white. Great, we know all that's working. So going back in here, yeah, so now we know that we can just modify those hue, saturation, and brightness values to whatever we want in this space here between this line, and we can modify those values. Again, I'm going slow just to make sure that this is understandable. And again, if you understand how all this works, then you can apply it in different circumstances other than just this rainbow effect. For whatever other reasons you might want to get the color of an object and mess with it. There's also a different field I didn't really talk about. There's an alpha color that has to do with transparency. You can mess with that too to make an object transparent and stuff like that. Anyways, so moving along here, now we want to go and actually, we're not even setting the saturation and hue values. We want to mess with the hue value. So actually what I can do, just to make sure this will work how we want it to, we can just go and set the saturation and the brightness values both to 1. That's making sure we're just getting the pure color that we want. So we're not getting the white and the black, because that would kind of not make the rainbow effect work. That's how we want it here. If you don't want that, then you can change the values how you want to. But anyways, now we want to go and mess with the hue value. So how we're messing with the hue value is by making it go from its lowest value to its highest value, which also I should probably explain here. So for some reason, I only actually noticed this just now when I'm recording this. If I go back to the material here, you may notice on here that the hue value goes between 0 and 360. Now, I noticed, I knew this with the other ones, they go from like 0 to 100 here, and with the RGB values, this goes all the way to 255. That's not how it works in code. This here might just be to make it look, I don't know, easier to handle in the inspector or something like that. But in actuality, in code, all of these values go between 0 and 1. And you can kind of see that here with the RGB. Those have this other mode where it goes between 0 and 1. But in code, even the hue, saturation, and brightness, they all go between 0 and 1. So actually 0 is the lowest of all of them, and 1 is the highest of all of them. Not 100, not 300. So that's just how that is. So we're gonna have to go and work with that in our code, just keeping that in mind. So if you're trying to set it to like, oh, I think that 50 would be half saturation. Oh, but it's getting pure color. Why is that happening? Well, that's why, because the highest is 1. So what we actually want to do is get the value to go from 0 to 1, and then when it hits 1, go back around to 0. So we are going to take whatever the hue value is on this current frame of like this update loop, and then we're going to want to set that, we basically want to increase it. It keeps increasing little by little every frame. So here, in this case, we go hue plus equals, which by the way is just going to, if we went plus equals 1, that's going to add 1 to this value every single frame. It's the exact same as going hue equals hue plus 1 in this case. So plus equals is just kind of a shorthand for that. So we're going to want to add some value. And now we don't necessarily know what value you need to add, or more specifically, it's something that we might want to change. So this is a perfect time to make it a public variable. So we're going to make a public variable that we can call, I guess, rainbow speed. Oh, and it has to be a float, I guess. But yeah, rainbow speed. I guess that's what we're calling it. It works. So we can go hue plus equals rainbow speed. And then another little thing, this technically isn't necessary, but I'm going to do it anyway. I know already that this number needs to be really, really, really small for this to work the way that we want it to. So to make the numbers nicer in the inspector, I'm actually going to divide this number by 10,000. And that is just how really, really small we need the number to be, because again, this is going to be updating every single frame. So potentially 60 times a second. So we need this to be really small. So I'm just going to divide that by 10,000 and then add that to the hue. So yes, that should work then with getting the colors from, or getting the hue from 0 to 1. But now we need to make sure that once it hits 1, that we need to have it wrap back around to 0 so that it doesn't just get stuck at red. Which red, by the way, back in the tutorial, yeah, both ends, as I said before, both ends of the hue are red. So that's what I mean by that. So back over here. So what we want to do is then test if it's greater than 1 and then set it back to 0. So we can just go if hue is greater than or equal to 1, then hue equals 0. Ta-da! And now we can go back into Unity, let it compile, and now on our actual Rainbow Effect scripts, they all have this rainbow speed here, which I found that a good number for it is 15. So now we go into play mode, and huzzah! All the this rainbow effect stuff is working. So in a very basic sense, we have our rainbow effect done. But we can do more with it. As I showed you in the beginning, I wanted to make different things for being able to randomize them, because maybe you don't want all of these to be going in the exact same, at the exact same time, because it might just look bad. If you want, like, it might look better if you want them to be doing the rainbow effect, but at slightly different times. So how we can go about doing that, well, we're going to go see how we're going to do that right now. So the first thing we're going to want to do is at the top, we just want to see whether or not we want to randomize it. So we're just going to make a public Boolean called randomize. And this is more for just customization in the inspector so that we can flip this value on and off depending on what we want. So now the randomization actually is only going to happen right at the beginning, right when the game first starts or when this script first happens. We're just going to have it start at a random value between 0 and 1. The hue value, I mean. So what we're going to do is in start, after we get the mesh renderer, we can just go if randomize is true, then we can go hue equals a random number between 0 and 1. So we can do that by using the function random.range and then 0f and 1f. Now it's important here to put those f's there because we want these to be float values, or more specifically, we want them to be decimals, not just the integer values 0 or 1. Or actually in this case, if we just did this, that would only ever return 0 because random.range with an integer goes all the way up until whatever the last number is, but that's more beyond the scope of what we're doing here. All that matters is we're just picking a random number between 0 and 1 and all the decimals in between. So yeah, this is all we want here. And another small thing that was just a little bit of optimization here is setting the saturation and the brightness to 1. We can do that right at the beginning because nothing here should ever modify the saturation and brightness. We only need to set it to 1 once at the beginning, so then it should stay 1 unless something else is changing it, which that's not happening here. And then, well, actually, to actually set the hue the way that we want it to, we're just going to want to quickly go and do this because this is the line of code that's actually setting the material. I almost forgot to do that, and then it wouldn't have been working right. So yeah, once we set these starting values for the hue, saturation, and brightness, we're just sticking it in here. So ta-da, that's all working. So now, again, back to Unity, we now have this randomize button here. I guess I'll check that for all of our materials here. Going into play mode, ta-da, they all started their rainbowing at different points. So now they look like they're all moving, they're not all in unison, which can be a good thing. As well, as I showed before, we can increase the rainbow speed, have it go really fast, or we could make the rainbow speed really small, to have it be a slow gradient, if this happened to be what you wanted in your game, or whatever. Yeah, so now, this is working. Now, we're not done just yet. We're basically done. We have the effect that we want, we have the randomization, but just for the sake of slightly more customizability, I do just want to quickly add in that invert option that I also had. So basically, instead of the number increasing of how the collectible, how the hue moves, instead of it going from 0 to 1 and flipping, having it go from 1 the other way to 0 and then flipping back to 1. Yeah, basically that's all there is to that. Now, in order to do that, first we are going to make another public bool called invert, and if this is true, we invert the direction that we're going, otherwise we don't. So all that really matters here is that this hue, where it's adding the rainbow speed and it's testing if it's greater than 1, we want to sort of subtract the rainbow speed so it goes down, and then see if it's less than 0, then flip around to 1. So yeah, we're going to do that. So then if invert, then we're going to have whatever invert code is. Otherwise, if invert is not true, then do the code that we already had. Now I'm just going to copy and paste this here because we're going to be changing it. So I don't need to retype all of it. So first, we want to have it subtract the rainbow speed. And then if hue is less than or equal to, all right, no, if it's less than 0, I guess less than or equals would work too. Yeah, because that shouldn't really make a difference. Now, here's a problem here. One small little thing that I didn't notice at first. Setting it to exactly 1 has problems, and I think I know why that is. But setting it to 0.99, however many nines you want, that works better. Or that makes it actually work. In my testing, setting the hue to exactly 1 there, let me actually go and test this just to show. So now we have the invert effect, and that is working. Going into play mode, huzzah! It's kind of hard to tell, but it might be better if I, make this a lot smaller. But now the colors are doing the rainbow effect in the opposite direction. So you could do a 50-50 of some going in one direction, some going the other. I don't know how much that would really change things. I just wanted to give that option. But by setting the thing here, this to exactly 1, it causes it to go to 0 and then be stuck being red. And I think that's because when you get the hue value here, or specifically, if you set the hue value to exactly 1, because 1 and 0 as a hue are the exact same, being that solid red, I think when you pass 1 to this, it kind of corrects it into being 0. And then when you get this back here, it thinks that it's 0, it sets it to 1, and then it goes right back to being 0. So it kind of gets stuck at 0 before it gets to subtract again. So just giving it like almost at 0, or sorry, almost at 1, so it's 0.99, that sort of fixes that. It's the same thing where Unity with rotations under the hood, how it deals with that. So if you rotate something beyond 360 degrees, if you rotate something beyond 360 degrees, some of the rotation things in Unity will sort of correct that back to being 0. So anything beyond 360 will be, whatever that value is minus 360. So I think the same principle applies to the colors here. So if you're having problems with some of your color or rainbow stuff not working, that might be something to look into. Just tossing that out there, because who knows, that might help someone who's been struggling on a problem like this for hours or whatever. I've been in that situation. It's not fun. But yeah, anyways, that brings us to the end of this tutorial. So now we have this rainbow effect to just make things look fancier, I suppose, just giving games a little bit more polish or whatever. And then we have a lot of options. You can make it slower, you can make it really fast, you can invert the speed, and you can have them all be in unison or whatever. And then you can customize which ones are doing what. And then beyond, so in this case, I'm just using this with like collectibles, just to make them flashier, to show, hey, this is something you can pick up. But there's probably a lot of different uses that you can use for this rainbow effect. You could, I don't know, maybe like a title screen, something in the background, just, some environmental stuff. We're just making something look fancier. And even just the other skills, I guess, that went into making this rainbow effect. Hopefully this teaches you something else fancy you could do with colors by, being able to directly modify saturation and brightness. Maybe you make the brightness go between 0 and 1 or something. So then you have, I don't know, a color. Actually, if you make the saturation 0, and then you mess with the brightness, that could make a color transition between like black and white. And then maybe you could mess with the inverting thing here, where it goes from black, once it hits white, invert becomes true, so then it goes from white back down to black, and when it hits black, then it inverts again. Maybe. I'm just tossing out ideas, because there's a lot of different things that you can do with this. So I guess my challenge to you is to go out and try and do something like that. Use something that you learned here today to do something interesting in your game, something unique and whatever. I don't know. At this point, I'm just rambling. But anyways, I think that will do it for this tutorial. So thank you all so much for watching. If you have any ideas for tutorials that you want to see, please leave them in the comments below. But again, thank you all so much for watching. And as always, I'll see you around.